introducing myself. For those who were to say, my name is Yaduvadu. This is my wife in the corner, Yaduvadu Prabhu, Mataji. She hates being called Mataji.
I use this when it's finished.
Now, I'm just going to go around. Maybe you can tell me some of your names. I know Maestro, I know Manu, I know Robert.
Divya Simha.
Sorry?
Divya Simha.
Divya Simha. Oh, that's Chris?
Less.
Sorry?
Less.
Less. Yours, Sorry? Right, okay.
Chris.
I know yours, Chris. Yeah, Adi, I remember.
Jakub.
Jakub.
Gary.
Gary. Oh, you're Jiva.
Divya Simha.
Your name? Lada. Oh, that's nice. Sorry? Borna. Aya. Okay. Last night I gave an overview of the Celtic traditions which pertain to Britain and Ireland, because actually it was one tradition. Ireland would have been considered part of Britain. It's not part of England, because the English were Anglo-Saxons who came in the 6th century, but as far as the earlier Britons, which would include the Scottish and the Irish, they were all originally one nation. They all had different kingdoms, and but they were all one nation. They all had the same traditions. So I gave an overview of some of the similarities in the Celtic tradition to the with the Vedic tradition in India. And there are many writers, and as some of you weren't here yesterday, I'll begin by just quoting a few of them. There is a consensus amongst academics that there are many parallels between the Druids of the West and the Brahmins of the East. One very famous writer who trained here at Trinity College in the 1960s, his name was Peter Berfidelis. He's written about 35 books on the Celts and Druids. Am I speaking too fast?
That's okay.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of something that he's written in his book, The Druids, 1994. The Indo-European hypothesis is important to any study of the Celts, and is one to which we must return as a means of explaining the extraordinary parallels and similarities between Celtic and Hindu cultures, occurring in the areas of language, law, religious attitudes, mythology, music, and caste. That will just give you an idea. Many historians, they talk about the parallels between the Celts and Hindus. But they're comparing it to what they know of Hindu culture today. They have no real knowledge or understanding of Vedic culture, which is the oldest culture in the world. H.G. Wells. Okay, I'm getting off the subject again here now, but I'm going to come back to these in a minute. H.G. Wells, a very famous English author, he writes about a type of people in the distant Stone Age who he calls the Heliolithic people. And the Heliolithic people are so called because they are said to worship the sun, Helio, and lithic, stones. So today, some of you have been to New Grange, you will have seen some of the stone monuments in Ireland. But these stone monuments exist in every country of the world. Okay, let's see if I can find this one note. And I'll just read this. I've got it. Oh, there's one picture of a dolmen in India. Pass it round. It's exactly like the dolmens that you find in Ireland. Or cromlech, or whatever you may call them.
Is that called a vilpati?
A what?
Is the vilpati a general term for such a structure?
I've no idea what the general term in India is, or whether it's the name of the place where it's found. Okay, I'll pass this round as well, actually. As I'm talking, you can just sort of flick through these few pages here, because these are a few photographs of standing stones and what we'd call from the Neolithic culture, which are to be found in India. These are standing stones, these are burial chambers, as you see here. Just sort of pass it around. There's no rush, you can just flick through them for a few moments each and then just pass them on as I'm talking. The Indian megaliths. I felt I was a bit disorganized yesterday because I didn't have all the papers at hand. Anyway, what you see at New Grange and what you see throughout Ireland is part of a worldwide culture that existed in the period that archaeologists would call the Stone Age. And it's been termed the Heliolithic, as I said, because it's known that the people of that time worshipped the sun and they worshipped stones. And it's not exactly that they worshipped the sun. It's that they studied astronomy. They studied the movement of the stars. They were expert astronomers. And these people built monuments on the ground made of stone, which were geometrically aligned to the stars of the zodiac. One English professor, Professor Tom, that's his surname, he came across some of these stones in 1932 when he was on holiday. He was a professor at Oxford University. And being an engineer, he studied the measurements of the stone circle and he found that they were precisely aligned. And he said, however rough these monuments may look in the field, they are perfectly aligned to certain constellations. Very, very accurately aligned. They were built in the period that we would call the Stone Age. But he said the level of mathematics that would have been required to build such monuments would have required universities to teach that level of geometry. So obviously what we think of as the Stone Age,
could you explain what alignment to the stars means exactly? Like how does the stone circle align
to the stars of the zodiac? I've got it all written down. I can give you one of these to read, might be easier, because I'm sort of going off the track and I can't explain it very well because I'm not an astronomer, but I have done the study and I have written it down. So that would be the best thing, is for you to just read it yourself. So, where was I? So H.G. Wells, he writes in his book in the 1920s, The Outline of History, that there was a people called the Heliolithic. And they had what amounts to a universal culture throughout the world, back into the Stone Age, the deep Stone Age, the distant Stone Age. And he's talking about maybe 20,000 years or so. And he said somehow or another, this culture was more advanced than any other culture that we have seen on the planet. And he tries to explain how it must have been passed from country to country. And his only explanation is that it must have begun somewhere in the east, and dark-skinned people must have gone in canoes from country to country, spreading this knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and engineering, which is highly unlikely. So academics themselves, they have some inkling of a universal culture. Because in all of those countries at that particular time, we find that they were ruled by sages, not by kings. They have common features. And these sages were predominantly vegetarian. they taught the transmigration of the soul. They were astronomers, they were engineers, and they had great learning. But academics have a problem understanding how it was that there was such an advanced culture 20,000 years ago, but somehow it's been lost. Because if we look at our own history, and we go back to medieval times, we find that throughout Europe, for example, people were uneducated, they were very unclean, they're very superstitious, and our present society has slowly developed since the Renaissance, since the revival of learning. We've gradually developed, all our different sciences. So it's very difficult for us to appreciate that before this time, that there were great civilizations and that there were there was great knowledge and great learning, which has somehow or another been lost. So, okay. Maestro was asking yesterday about the parallels that I was speaking of between the Celts and the Hindus. Because I myself, I always felt very disappointed when I read books on Druids and Celts. And they'd always allude to these parallels, but they'd never exactly explain what these parallels are. So I spent months actually researching these. And first of all, I've got a little paper here. I've got a little paper with the 16 parallels between the Celts and Hindus. That was how I started. I started finding 16 parallels. And then I found a few more. And I found a few more. And so I've got here 150 parallels between the ancient Celts and Hindus. Now with some of these there's a bit of an overlap in some ways, because the one parallel might actually, you don't necessarily need to mention it twice in a slightly different way. But before I go into these, I'll read again a quote that I read last night by Henry Herbert. Now, Henry Herbert was a French author, and he was supposed to be one of the world's greatest experts in the Celts. He spent the whole of his life writing a book, and the book was called The Greatness and Decline of the Celts. And it was published in 1934. Unfortunately, just a few months after he passed away. So it was published posthumously. He never actually saw the book, but he spent his whole life working on it. It was his life's work. And he is considered to be one of the greatest authorities on the Celtic history. So Henry Herbert, he writes in his book, the priesthoods, in other words, Druid and Brahmin, are not merely very similar, but exactly the same. And they are preserved nowhere so completely as the two opposite ends of the Indo-European world. And to follow on from that, if I can just quickly find the right page. I described yesterday about a book which was translated called Baradas. It was published at the Eisteddfod in Wales of 1862. At Pontypridd, which is actually where I was born. I was born in Pontypridd. But in 1862, on the hill above Pontypridd, where they have standing stones and an ancient rocking stone, they held an Eisteddfod. And that year, the chief bard was called Mifir Morganwg. And actually he was a disciple of the bard I described yesterday, Ilu Morganwg. He was his disciple. And at this assembly in Pontypridd in 1862, Mifir Morganwg, he gave a long address on the meaning of Baradas and the ancient traditions of Wales. I'll read some of this, will be better than me speaking about it. At this assembly, on the hillside above Pontypridd, the Welsh bards included prayers to Durga as the ancient mother goddess of Britain. Mifir Morganwg also points out that the bards of Wales recognize that their teachings are the same as those of the Hindus. And this is just another little bit that I've added to it. In his book, Ancient Man in Britain, 1922, Donald Mackenzie, this is with reference to Durga. In his book of 1922, Donald Mackenzie describes a Scottish deity called Yellow, oh God, I can't pronounce this now, Murli Tiak, by the sound of it. Anyway, that resembles Kali, as well as a goddess known as Black Annis of Leicester, who had an eye on her forehead and a girdle of skulls around her waist. Okay, back to Mifir Morganwg. Mifir Morganwg said that Baradas as is clear to every initiated bard, the remains of that sublime learning as it existed in the Isle of Britain, anterior to Christianity, such as those such as those extracts about the elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The migration of the soul from ignorance to the extreme good in Gwynvid, or pure knowledge. The mystic name for God, as well as the nature of Kithrol, which means material bondage in ancient Welsh. Nifer Morganwg, he said at that address, every fragment that can thus be made public of what once related to the primitive Gorsedd, or throne of the bards, is truly valuable. Insomuch as it was this simple, moral and sublime system that constituted the very foundation of the primitive worship, legislature, and scholastic institutes of the nation, and was the living means of promoting learning and morality amongst all classes of people in early times. The manuscripts that were put into Baradas were from the collection of Ill Morganwg, who died in 1824. He was a bard of Britain. He spent his life collecting these manuscripts. And if you think at a time when people believed that the earth, that the world was 6,400 years old, the bards had a concept of the world being billions of years old, and indeed of our transmigrating through different species of life for millions of years. So this, one of the chapters of Baradas, actually the first chapter, is called Symbol. And it contains an interesting system of numbers. Now, this reminds me of something that Lord Buddha said, because Lord Buddha was asked once by a disciple, how many lives do we take in the material world? So, Lord Buddha said, you imagine if there was a piece of marble and it was 6 miles high and it was 6 miles wide and it was 6 miles deep, and then imagine that a dove flew past that marble once in every 100 years. And in his beak, he had a silk scarf. And as he flew past the marble, the silk scarf would rub against it. He said, the length of time that it would take that dove to wear the marble down to nothing is the length of time that the living entity spends in the material world, just going from birth to death, from birth to death. So there's something similar here in Baradas. This is only to, obviously, to teach. It's part of their symbols, in order to teach their disciples, to give the disciple the idea of the length of time that we spend in the material world. So it's a system of counting, and it goes like this. The first numbers are in English, and then it goes into Welsh, archaic Welsh. 10 ones are 10. 10 tens are 100. 10 hundreds are 1,000. 10 thousands are a myriad. A myriad myriads are a million. A million millions are a munt. 1,000 million. A munt munts are a rialu. A million billion billion. A rialo rialos are a buna. A buna buna are a tira. Tirva, I should say. 100 million billion billion. A kativa, kativas. Sorry, a tirva are a kativa. A kativa, kativas are a kadrod, which is 1,000 million billion billion. And then he says, a kadrauds are calculated as the number of lives from a noon to Gwynfyd. In other words, the number of births the soul takes in the cycle of Gwynfyd within the material world. So, I don't know if I read this last night. Before I go into these parallels, sorry, we're going to have to wait 5 minutes. I'll read a little bit from Baradas about karma. It's quite interesting the way they put it. Because we often say, oh, what can we do? We're so fallen. We can't follow. As far as they were concerned, you should follow. I'm a hypocrite saying this because I'm the last person who follows properly. Anyway, karma in Baradas. Humanity is a state of liberty, where man can attach himself to either good or bad as he pleases. If his good qualities predominate over his bad qualities at the time of death, his soul passes into Gwynfyd, or a state of bliss. For those who weren't here yesterday, Gwynfyd is archaic Welsh. Gwyn is still in use. Gwyn means white or pure. And vid means knowledge. It's from the word vidya, Sanskrit. So, if our good qualities predominate at the time of death, then we pass to a higher state, which what they're saying there is that we go to the heavenly planets. this is a little interesting piece that Elmer Gunnock had written on his manuscript, that this is taken from the book of D. Richard of Landochen. Oh, Landoch, it's not Landoch. It's pronounced Landoch, of Cardiff. So he's one of the old bards who lived outside Cardiff about 2 centuries ago. Anyway, but if bad predominates, his soul descends in a bread to an animal corresponding in character to the disposition he exhibited just before he died. It will then rise as before, until it again arrives at the point of liberty, human birth, where it will have another chance of clinging to the good. But if it fails, it must fall again. And this will happen for ages and ages, until at last its attainment to good predominates. If a wicked man is punished by death for an injurious evil, his soul will enter another human body instead of a beast, reptile or bird in a bread. Okay, what does this mean? Actually, this exactly corresponds to the Vedas. If a wicked man is punished by death, so that means supposing you commit murder and you get the death penalty. If you're punished by death, then the reaction is destroyed, the reaction that you would suffer by going down into the lower species. Then that soul will enter another human body instead of a beast or a reptile. According to the Vedic system, when a judge is sentencing some sort of offender, he will first think, what would happen to this person if he was unapprehended by the laws of nature? What sort of reaction would this person get in the course of time? And so the judge awards a punishment so that he won't have to go through any future ordeal like this, that it will just be got out of the way. Whatever the punishment is, if it's for theft or whatever, murder, then the judge awards a punishment, and then he doesn't have to suffer in his next life. This is the idea, that the judge will, in his mind, just try and think what would happen to this person if I were not to judge him, if he was to be judged, by the laws of nature or by the supersoul. So here that says the same thing. Dudley Wright mentions a Cornish saying of the present day, which illustrates the ancient Druidic doctrine. Okay, I got problem with pronouncing things sometimes, but I'll give it a go. Nai fuil an sablas an ragad death. It's probably nothing like that. But that's the Cornish saying, which means there is nothing in death but a change or alteration in life. And that he wrote in 1924. Dudley Wright. Okay, this is back to Baradas. After having arrived at the point of humanity in a bread where bad and good equiponderate. I'll read that line again. After having arrived at the point of humanity in a bread, so we get the human form of life after coming up through all of these animal species. And in the human form of life, good and bad equiponderate. This is an old Victorian word, we wouldn't use this anymore. Or equiponderate, probably. Man is free from all obligations, because goodness and wickedness do not press upon one another, nor does one of them preponderate over the other. Therefore, the state of man is a state of will and freedom and ability, where every act is one of project and selection, consent and choice, and not of obligation and dislike, necessity and inability. So in other words, what we do is what we decide to do, not what we're forced to do. So on this account, man is a living being capable of judgment, and judgment will be given upon him and his acts, for he will be good or bad according to his works, since whatever he does, he could do differently. Therefore, it is right that he should receive punishment or reward as his works require. Okay, this is an interesting point too. I'll finish this part on this verse. In every state and point of a bread that is below humanity, all beings are necessarily ignorant, like animals, for example, and necessarily bound to ignorance from their utter want of will or power. An animal has no real ability to decide between good or bad. It's only in the human form of life. And it says here, notwithstanding all the exertion and the power put forth. So, we see in animals so much power, but still they don't have the power to make decisions in the way that a human being does. On this account, God does not hate or punish them, but loves and cherishes them, because they cannot do otherwise, and because it is from obligation and not willingly that they are in this condition. So the Vedas say the same, that animals eat meat or do whatever, they may kill, but they don't get a reaction. So this is saying the same thing. I'll read a few of the triads of the bards. They're quite nice. Theological triad. Because the bards wrote all of their teachings down in threes. These are just a few examples. The three requirements of God at the hands of man, or otherwise the duty of a bard, is to do justice. So this is more or less the duty of a bard, what we're saying here, is to do justice, to impart learning and good sciences to those that are deficient in them, to urge upon everyone mercy towards all living beings of every kind and form. Well, that would include vegetarianism, wouldn't it? To urge upon everyone mercy towards all living beings. Three things that ought to be considered seriously 3 times every day. The laws of truth, the laws of love, and the laws of God. Three things that can never be. Cause of fear in the world to come, for one who gives no concern to fear in this world. There we go. This is a nice one. Number 2. Something that can never be. A lack of mercy after this world, for one who shows nothing but mercy in this earthly life. So if you show mercy in this life, there can be no lack of mercy for you. The third thing, a lack of knowledge for him who, to the utmost of what he knew, has established knowledge to every man fond of knowledge, and to all who require it, or might be seen to want it. Okay, let's just read a few of these. The 3 beautiful qualities of a bard. Obedience, learning, and affectionate disposition. The 3 silent reserves of a bard. In respect to injurious truth, to avoid speaking unpalatable truths which might disturb the minds of others. In respect to unnecessary judgment, in other words, to avoid criticism. In respect to everything uncertain, in other words, to avoid speculation. 3 things a bard ought to do. To listen carefully to everything. To look fully at everything. To hold his peace soundly, unless there be good reason for speech. 3 things which a bard ought to practice in his song and conduct. When they talk about his song, they're talking about his knowledge, which is retained as poetry, and they call that his song. This is why Wales is known as the land of song, because it was the land of poetry, it was the land of bardism, where the information was recorded in poetic form. Three things a bard ought to practice in his song and conduct: to increase sciences, to soften manners, and to console the mind. There are three men who ought not and cannot be made bards: the idle, the proud, the liar.
Eagle.
The idle, people who are lazy. There are 3 men who ought not and cannot be made bards. There are 3 avoidances of a bard: to avoid bearing arms, for there ought to be no weapon against him, either in country or border country. So a bard would never carry a weapon, because he could then pass freely from country to country, teaching or preaching or whatever. And because he never had a weapon, and he's considered to be a holy man, then he would never be at risk of being attacked. So to avoid bearing arms, these are the 3 avoidances of a bard. To avoid rudeness and immorality. For he is a man subject to the law of morality and correct conduct. To avoid indolence, for he is a man of exertion. There are 3 dignified privileges of a bard, and that is maintenance wherever he goes. That he's taken care of. Just like in India, wherever you go, well, sort of a Brahmin, people will always come and look after the Brahmins. Or if a holy man sits down in a sacred place, people will come and bring him so many things. Some people come there with food every day and whatever he requires. He won't have to go out and make any special effort. But in ancient times, actually the bards and the druids, they were maintained by the kings who, under whose jurisdiction they served. So they have a maintenance wherever he goes. That there should be no weapon drawn against him. And 3, that his word should be paramount over all. So the word of a bard is final, just like the word of a Brahmin is final. There are 3 institutional laws of a bard. To maintain peace and tranquility wherever he goes. To exhibit instruction in regular and commendable sciences and usages, improving and amplifying them. This is an interesting point, because although they learn so many thousands, 20,000 sacred verses off by heart, and their life is given to knowledge, and they learn every form of knowledge. Actually, just like Krishna and Balaram, when they went to their Gurukul, they learned all the arts and crafts. They not only learnt about spiritual sciences, but they learnt about... there are only 64 arts and crafts, and they learnt every one of them. It says that in the Brahma Samhita, actually. Bhaktisiddhanta writes that in the purport of the Brahma Samhita, that they learned how to make gems, they learned about metal work, they learned all the arts and crafts. So a bard or a Brahmin, their job is not just to pass on what they know, but always to try and increase and amplify their knowledge. Bhaktivinoda actually says the same thing, that there are always new truths. We should always be searching for new truths, because there are so many out there. There are so many new things to learn. And even Prabhupada himself, he said that he learns new things every day. Never stop learning. So they're always increasing their knowledge, always increasing their science. And the third is to keep a regular memorial of what is meritorious of the sciences and systems of the country and nation. So in Wales it was the bards who kept the histories, recorded the genealogies, and in India it's the Brahmins who do that. In their local villages they keep long records of the genealogy of the people who, genealogies of the people who live in their area. Okay, I think I'll finish with this. For which a bard should be deprived of his degree. So there's 3 things for which you'll be punished. If you're a bard and you do these, you'll be punished. And that is for divulging a secret which he holds in respect of his office and sacred poems. For murder, for robbery, for enlisting as a soldier. If a bard enlists as a soldier, then he will be barred from being a bard. Because he is thus exposing himself to weapons. so that he cannot visit country and border country at the call and necessity of country and lord. And another thing is for telling a falsehood, so that his word cannot be paramount and cannot avail between country and border country in any investigation. So therefore his word, he should be above reproach. Whatever word a Brahmin, a bard says, should be completely honest. Anyway, enough of that. Right. Okay, so I started. It's 7:30. I need to go on till 8 o'clock. It's no. I go until 6. Anyone feeling uncomfortable? Anyone want a break for 5 minutes? Stand up. Yeah. Okay. Let's have a break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back for the last part of this. Is it? About the address that Miva Morgano gave in Pontypridd in 1862. The quote that I wanted wasn't there in the book. I couldn't find it. But what he tells everyone, there was a huge assembly of people above Pontypridd on that day. And he said, if anyone wants to understand the ancient teachings of the Welsh, they have only to look at the ancient teachings of the Hindus, because they're exactly the same. And it was a real nice quote, and I couldn't find it. Okay, I've got to get better organised for this sort of thing, you know, in future. I'm just going to go through these parallels, which I actually wrote down about 10 years ago. So there may be some things that I would change now. I'm not sure. Certainly, it all needs to be reviewed. But number one, Brahmins and Druids were both the most respected members of society. Brahmins and Druids were of higher status than kings. In both cultures. The kings of India and Britain would never act without the sanction of a Brahmin or Druid. The killing of a Brahmin or bard was considered to be a crime of the highest degree. Brahmins and Druids were referred to in both countries as gods on earth. The Sanskrit term for this is Bhudeva, gods of earth, gods on earth. Because sometimes it's interesting, you read these books what we have left of the Bardic writings, and you come across these terms, and they're exactly the same terms that you've read in the Vedas. Brahmins and Druids were considered to be the intermediaries between God and man. Brahmins and Druids were referred to as men of science in both countries. The compound wid in Druid. Druid is a mispronunciation. The Romans called the sages of Britain Druids, but they were known as Druid. It's mispronounced as Druid. But the wid is from the Sanskrit vid, inferring wisdom, and dur is from the Sanskrit word meaning, it has several meanings, it means renounced, dhira, from dhira. Brahmins and Druids received a regular maintenance in respect of their office. So neither of them did manual work, but they received payment. Brahmins and Druids are described as being of the highest moral character. I'm not sure if this is an old list, and I've written another one since, but there's certain things that are at the top of this list which I don't see unless it's sort of further through. Anyway, Brahmins and Druids initiated their young religious students. Initiation was considered to be a spiritual rebirth in both cultures. Both had a secret doctrine which they taught only to initiated disciples. Brahmins and Druids taught their congregation simple truths in the form of mythological tales and heroes and gods, of heroes and gods. Celts and Hindus have a similar word for knowledge. In India it's Veda, in Welsh, and in other places of Europe, in Sweden and places, the ancient knowledge is called Veda.
In Poland, wiedza.
Pardon?
In Poland, wiedza.
Ah, again,
Similar.
similar. Brahmins and Druids created colleges where academic subjects were taught. If a person did not learn their trade from a Brahmin or Druid, they were not considered qualified. Brahmins and Druids were the lawmakers and magistrates of their respective societies. Both Brahmins and Druids were fully trained in matters of law and settled all disputes. Brahmins and Druids were responsible for recording the significant events and genealogy of their race. Brahmins and Druids divided their society into 4 social and spiritual orders, which is the hallmark of a Vedic society. Celtic and Hindu cultures possessed a warrior class. The warriors of both countries fought on chariots. Indian and Celtic warriors both pulled their chariots with teams of horses. Indian and Celtic warriors used charioteers to drive the chariots while they fought. Celtic chariots were known as cars. Coming from the Sanskrit word ka, which means motion. The Indian and British warriors gave their weapons personal names. The warrior class of Britain and India had a similar appearance. There's a bit of an overlap here, but I described in 31, both wore their hair long, whereas the Brahmins and the Bards, they shaved their head, the Kshatriyas wore long hair, and they generally had moustaches. The British and Indian warriors wore brightly coloured clothes. Both were fastidious about their appearance. They're very proud of the way they looked. The warrior class in Britain and India practiced martial arts. This is described by the Romans. The Romans said that a whole group of foreigners would be no match for one warrior, one Celtic warrior. And they described that their women were just as fierce. The female warriors that I wish I had it somewhere amongst you. I've got the quotes, but the Romans describe what it's like to see a female warrior in action, and it describes that they're very tall and very strong. And that they not only fight by raining blows with their fists, but they spin in the air and they kick out with their feet. And even 20 soldiers would not be able to beat one woman. So the way they describe it, you can see that they're talking about knowledge of martial arts. They twist and turn and kick while they're in the air. The warriors of Britain and India preferred to die in battle rather than of old age. The Vedic and Celtic warriors possessed the same ideals of chivalry, the same idea of honor. Britain and India had a Gurukul system. In Britain and Ireland, the children who were to be bards would go off, they would leave their parents around the age of 5 and they would go and live with their master. One became a bard or Brahmin by qualification, not birth. Oh, I've got this here. A child training to be a bard or Brahmin would leave his parents by the age of 5 and live with his spiritual master until the age of 25. That was not only so that they would learn all forms of knowledge from their master or guru, but partly so that they wouldn't pick up all the bad habits of their parents. That was part of the thinking behind it. Because we inevitably become like our parents. We grow up, we become teenagers, and we hate our parents. And then we sort of, we get to 40 and we discover that we're just like them. Vanaprash existed in both cultures. The Vanaprash in India and Britain would live with their wives in the forest. Vanaprash in India and Britain often lived on nothing but milk. The period a Vanaprash spent in the forest was 30 years in India and Britain. Sannyas existed in both cultures. The sannyas and druid orders were adopted in the last quarter of life. Sannyasis and druids separate from their wives when they accept their respective offices. In the Indian and British system, their precepts, laws and sciences were handed down orally in the form of codified verses. Not just their spiritual knowledge, but their laws as well. Brahmins and Druids passed their knowledge on by disciplic succession. Brahmins and Druids chanted their sacred poems in meter. These verses are said to number 20,000 in both traditions. They learned these verses verbatim, and so they practiced the cultivation of memory to a very high degree. I put you that the sacred verses of the Brahmins and Druids were in Sanskrit. That would need a further explanation. Both placed great emphasis on pronunciation. Brahmins and Druids were skilled in mathematics. Brahmins and Druids are said to have been able to calculate the circumference of the earth. Brahmins and Druids had knowledge of sacred geometry. Both were skilled in engineering. Both were skilled in astronomy. Both held festivals to celebrate the summer and winter solstice and equinox. Both performed ritual and ceremonial fire sacrifice. Brahmins and Druids put foodstuffs into the fire while reciting sacred verses. Brahmins and Druids called the fire Agni. Actually, in the Welsh text, it's called Gni. But you can see, this is coming from an oral tradition where they didn't actually have spelling. And so when it's put down into language, if they're calling the god of the fire Gni, well, they're saying Gni and Agni, it's the same.
In Polish, ogień. Agni, ogień.
Oh, right. In Latin also, ignite. Brahmins and Druids worship deities. When the early Christians came to Britain, they were told by, I can't remember which Pope, Pope Gregory perhaps, that you should use the temples for the worship of Christ, but you should destroy all of their gods, all of the images of the gods. So we can see from this that they're worshipping deities. They had statues of gods. Brahmins and Druids were strict vegetarians. Brahmins and Druids had the same philosophy. Both taught that the soul originates in the spiritual world. Both taught that the soul falls from the spiritual world to the level of a worm. Birth and death was referred to as a cycle in both traditions. Brahmins and Druids taught the transmigration of the soul through animal as well as human forms. Both taught that the embodied soul takes billions of births. Brahmins and Druids taught the embodied soul passes through every form of existence. Brahmins and Druids taught that human life is meant only for spiritual realization. Brahmins and Druids taught that the goal of life is love of God. Brahmins and Druids taught that the goal of life can only be attained in the human form. Brahmins and Druids taught that if we neglect to become God conscious, we risk falling into the evolutionary cycle of birth and death. Both taught the doctrine of karma. Brahmins and Druids taught that we take animal bodies if we perform acts of cruelty. Brahmins and Druids taught that we should not fear death. Brahmins and Druids are said to have had the power of uttering magical incantations. Brahmins and Druids were forbidden to engage in manual occupation. Brahmins and Druids were forbidden to participate in war. The spiritual master of both traditions sat on elevated chairs. In India, called a Vyasasan, in Britain, the Bardic chair. Brahmins and Druids considered the cow to be sacred. The earth was symbolized in both cultures as a white cow. Brahmins and Druids considered the killing of a cow to be the most heinous of crimes. Brahmins and Druids taught the earth once took the form of a white cow and travelled to every country, giving unlimited quantities of milk and leaving carbs behind. Cows roamed free in ancient Britain, as they do in India. Cows were used as currency in Britain and India. Religion was symbolized in India and Britain as a white bull. Brahmins and Druids considered water to be sacred. Both named their rivers after the different manifestations of the mother goddess. Both considered the water's edge to be the best place for learning. The mother goddess was the personified earth in both cultures. In Druidical and Brahminical tradition, God creates the sky, while the goddess creates the earth. Both depicted the mother goddess as Durga, an armed female seated on a lion holding a trident. What this means is the ancient image of Britannia. Britannia is seen in the old coins as seated on a lion, and she's holding a trident, so she's an armed female sitting on a lion. These coins were current in Celtic times, and they were reintroduced into England in the reign of Charles II. And in the Victorian era, the lion was changed for a shield. In the old pennies that you see, Victorian pennies, you see that she's not on a lion, but she has a shield. So this was changed at that time.
Can I have a question? We call Britain. This is connected with Sanskrit word Britain.
Predane. I do have an explanation for it. It's the name of the mother goddess. Pred means earth. Dane. It refers. It's complicated. It refers to the water, really. Dane, Dan, and all the river names are
Like Danube or Dan.
like Danube. Or, the Don is coming from Dan, but it is coming from Sanskrit originally.
Could be connected to Prithvi.
I'm not sure.
You said some pronunciation.
Pred. Yeah, Pred.
Prithvi is the name for earth.
No, I can't tell you exactly. Although I've got most of these things written down. It's been so long since I've gone through them. I wish I had it all at my fingertips, but it's been so long. Okay. Brahmins and Druids called the mother goddess Tara. That was only one name. Brahmins and Druids called the mother goddess Anna. Brahmins and Druids believed in a personified sun god. Brahmins and Druids considered the sun to be a representation of the Supreme. Both recognize, okay, this is where you actually, this is actually where you see the resemblance between the bards and the Brahmins. Both recognize one supreme God. In India, below there's one supreme God. Sometimes he might be referred to as Vishnu. We know him as Krishna. but there's the Trimurti below that. And in the Bardic tradition, there's the same Trimurti. They're called the three blessed gods, and they're known in Welsh as the Tri Menwedig. The Tri Menwedig. I'll try it again. The Tri Menwedigon. I'm useless at pronouncing these Welsh words. I did Welsh in school, but this is archaic Welsh. Menwedigion. Yeah, Tri Menwedigion. And these are the three blessed gods, representing creation, maintenance, and the destruction in both traditions. So that's a Trimurti. Brahmins and Druids recognize a pantheon of over 300 lesser gods, most of whom were superintendents in charge of the different functions of nature. Brahmins and Druids acknowledge that God has many names. Okay, when the Romans came to Britain, they said that the Britons mostly worshipped Jupiter. And they said the same about the Egyptians. And they said the same about the Hindus. And when Strabo, the Roman historian Strabo, went to India, he said that the Indians are mostly worshipping Jupiter. So if we analyze what Jupiter represents, we see that he's Vishnu. The Greek god Zeus corresponds to Deus of the Rig Veda. And Jupiter is the Roman Zeus. His emblem is the eagle, just like Vishnu's emblem is Garuda. And he is said to ride on the back of the eagle, Aquila. His mark is the swastika symbol, and he is married to the goddess of fortune. So in the Vedas, the goddess of fortune is Lakshmi. In Rome, the goddess of fortune is Juno. So and he's also a sky god. Zeus, Deus, Vishnu, these are considered to be sky gods. They create the heavens. And they're called sky gods. There's a lot of symbolism in There's a lot of symbolism in Hinduism. For example, when Krishna... Okay, I'm right off the subject again now. Because yellow is the color of the harvest. And this signifies that he repeatedly takes birth on earth. And he is depicted as blue, as a sun god, because the sky is unlimited. The sky has no end. So there's certain symbolism that comes in. So when we look and we analyze the Roman gods who they saw in Britain, the Romans said that they're mostly worshipping Jupiter, which is, Jupiter is Sanskrit. Jew comes from Jyoti, and Peter, his father. So he's the father of light. So when the Romans come and they say the people of Britain are mostly worshipping Jupiter, the same as the people of India, it's not hard, it's a little bit of a puzzle to figure out, but it's not hard to understand. When he rides on the back of an eagle, when his weapon is the disc, Jupiter's weapon is the disc, or the thunderbolt. He is married to the goddess of fortune. We can see that they're talking about Vishnu. When they're talking about Minerva, we can see they're talking about Devi. When they talk about Mercury, we can see they're talking about Shiva, whose Mercury is worshipped in the form of a lingam. So it's quite easy to put these gods together. And this is why they're called Indo-European gods. The gods of Britain are defined by scholars as Indo-European, and the gods of India are defined as Indo-European. Krishna is an Indo-European god. The same as the gods of Scandinavia, etc. So, although you don't read, you'll never open a book and find written that the people of Britain are worshipping Vishnu or worshipping Krishna, then it's not very difficult to analyze. Okay, I'm on number 108. Rest are pretty boring. Let's see.
That's a question.
Yeah.
It's just in relation today, we're in Newbridge, and the persons were saying that the Celts came at some later time.
Yeah.
They're back from the 5th, 6th century BC, something like that. But all this, the stone, the heliocentric, that was all there, like the stone and
Yeah.
the actual symbols were
Yeah.
there. They dated it, I think it was 3200 BC to 2900.
Yeah.
And they were saying, and then outside from that there was another group that came 1,000 years later, because there's different stones there.
Yeah.
And they're not sure whether it was these people 3,000 years ago had a kind of changed to this, or whether another group came along.
Yeah.
But they still use that whole idea that the Celts migrated at a certain time.
They talk rubbish. Absolute rubbish. The reason they think this, it's all coming from an English scholar called John Rees, who was a 19th century scholar. And he was educated at Bonn University. And Bonn University was the home to all the scholars who created the Aryan invasion theories. It was one of the things I wanted to talk about, actually, but I haven't got time. Some of the scholars, they learned Sanskrit in the 19th century, and they discovered Indian artifacts in their archaeology. Then they, like the swastika symbols on their Stone Age pots and things, and they saw resemblances in their gods, the ancient gods of Europe. Then they formulated theories that these things must have been brought at some time from India by Aryans. And gradually they came up through Europe, and there was no doubt migrations of people at different times. We know that the gypsies have come from India, for example. They have migrated. There is some mention in the Vedas of certain races being sent into exile into Europe. life is a dynamic process. We get people coming and going, you know, to all sorts of places. And these people that lived 2,000 years ago were no different to us. Some of them might have lived in Europe and they thought, oh, I'll go to Britain, pre-Dane, I'll go to Ireland. You know, people moved about. But it was John Rees who created this idea that the Celts came to Britain a few hundred years BC, before this era. And he did it because he's building upon the ideas that he had learned at Bonn University from the German philosophers about the Aryans invading Europe, or if not invading, migrating into Europe. But there is no evidence at all. There isn't one shred of evidence to suggest, or not to suggest, there's plenty to suggest, there's no evidence to prove that these people came to Europe at that time. It's purely speculative. The problem is, like I was saying yesterday about the half-life of facts, that generally in science, that a thing is a fact until it's proven otherwise. And in science, things move quite fast. Something might be a fact only for a few years, and within 6 years it'll be proven to be false. Their ideas will be proven to be false. So in history that doesn't happen. That hasn't happened. Because we know nothing about our history really, and it's all being put together piecemeal by different scholars throughout time, very eminent people in their day, but so eminent that once they've made a particular statement, like John Rees, it was John Rees who decided that the earlier inhabitants of Britain went to Ireland and these Aryans came from Europe. And it's one person, Christian Thompson, who created the three-age system, that there was a Stone Age, there was a Bronze Age, and there was an Iron Age. And actually in his day, his idea was ridiculed. And his book on the three-age system was actually banned in Britain until the 1840s, because it was considered too absurd. But once these theories, and that's all they are theories, these various scholars have hypothesized these different ideas just to try and explain why a thing is a certain way, then in the academic field, no one really wants to go against them, because they're held in such high regard. So Christian Thompson, let's just take the three-age system: Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. He comes to this conclusion because he had all the artifacts on a table. He was the unpaid curator of the Denmark Museum. He was just an enthusiast, he wasn't a professional. He was the unpaid curator of the Denmark Museum. And he had all these artifacts that had been found, made of flint, metal, bronze. They're all on the table in front of him, and he sat there just trying to figure it out. Well, how are there all different types of tools? So he formulated the idea, well, it must have started off, because stone is more easily made than metal. You can chip the stone, you know, the flint, you can chip it out of the ground, and you can easily make a tool out of a piece of stone. To make things out of iron or bronze is much more difficult. It's a much more difficult formula. So his idea was that the society that existed in the first place must have been a Stone Age society, because they made stone tools. And then they must have been invaded by a society that made bronze tools that were better than the stone tools. So they must have been more advanced. And then they must have eventually been invaded by people who had iron making skills. And so they just look all upon it as they're just theories. And it's all part of this invasion. It's all part of the invasion theory. That they're just ways of trying to explain things that they have no answers for. But logically, there is no reason to think that Stone Age tools, or stone tools, flints, could not have been used by the same people that made iron tools. Because actually, these stone tools were very advanced. They have Stone Age saws, for example, which have 24 what would you call it, sort of serrated edge, like a jagged edge, 24 teeth. They're made very precisely, but this can only be seen under a microscope. It can't be seen with the naked eye. And they made these tools to a high, specification. So much so that many of them could not be duplicated today. So the idea that one society is ousted by another society because they use a different type of tool, there's no saying at all that the same people didn't use all those different tools at the same time. For example, when they're known to perform brain surgery, trepanning, where they cut the brain open because they found skeletons where people have had this operation and the top of their skull has been cut open and it's been sewn back together again, and they've lived, they've survived. So they can, I got a whole book here. I got a whole book here on it actually.
Could I just ask another thing? So the alternative understanding is that the same society was in existence throughout the world. The same.
Yes. What I was going to say about the stone tools. We have all sorts of tools today. We could use all different types of tools for all. They're cheap tools. They're expensive tools, right? The good thing about the advantage over a knife that was made from flint was that it was much more hygienic to use. If you're performing brain surgery, you're less likely to get an infection than if you're cut open with a knife. So these tools could have been used for many different reasons. It's just a whole fascinating area because, we think of the Stone Age as a really primitive time. But in the Stone Age, when these instruments were being sold, these tools, there were salesmen on the road selling them. They would load up their carts. They would travel from town to town, from city to city, selling these things. They had salesmen. they had trade guilds, they had factories where these things were being made. It was extremely organized. It wasn't just a few people with furs sitting down just chipping away at a bit of stone and then using it to cut someone's head open. You know, it was it was extremely organized.
And they were using volcanic glass.
Sorry?
They were using volcanic glass.
They're using glass as well. I've got a book that I've written there, which is called Inexact Science, that gives some explanation of the advancement of the science in ancient times, where you've got an electric battery, which is still today in the Baghdad Museum, which is 2,400 years old. And it still works. It will still produce electric light. And in the pyramids, they found malleable glass that can be shaped and bent, moved. Yet, that process was not invented until 1971. But they found it in the pyramids thousands of years old. And they certainly had electricity when making the inner chambers of the pyramids, because they say if they used candles, then it would have caused carbon, which would have still lined the ceiling. But they went deep into the tombs, and there's no evidence of any carbon or any such thing. And they had some things which were just some amazing things, like everlasting, ever-burning lamps, which didn't burn on fuel, which they opened the pyramids and these lamps had been burning inside for 4,000 years. Anyway, if anyone wants to read my book, Inexact Science, it's not for sale, but you can borrow it. Many things like that. I mean, you know, it's quite a few years since I've worked on this stuff, so I can't just rattle it all off and explain everything.
It's interesting today when they were talking about 5,000 years ago and 4,000 years ago. They kept on saying, we don't know, we have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he couldn't resist the tendency to keep doing that. And eventually he went off about the Celts.
Yeah.
Almost immediately afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a gap around 2,000 years in most of the countries, in most of the history. So, or there was nobody on this planet during 2,000 years, or something very different happened, which history didn't speak about it because nobody couldn't understand.
Just so we finish, I'll just read you a passage from this. Okay, this is a drawing here of a handheld electrical battery, which is in the Museum of Baghdad, and it's somewhere. Okay. Okay. I'll just read this as an example. Examples of ancient technologies. In 1938, while working on Cupid, just outside Baghdad, the German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig unearthed a 5-inch long clay jar containing a copper rod cylinder that encased an iron rod. These electric dry batteries, now displaced at the Baghdad Museum and dated to around 200 BC, work on the galvanic principle, where electricity is produced by a chemical action. Remarkably, these batteries were made around 2,000 years before the time of Luigi Galvani, who lived in between 1737 and 1798, after whom the process was named. There is also an Assyrian crystal lens from the 7th century BC, which experts say requires a very sophisticated mathematical formula to grind, while in Egypt and Iraq cut crystal lenses have been found, which can only be made by an electrochemical process. So there are many examples of technology which has actually been lost. I got I got Rancho's scribbles all over this book because he reads it and he, like a teacher. He writes where where I'm going wrong, and then he sends it back to me. Okay, there was one other interesting thing that I just wanted to read from this. Okay, let me show you something else. We have here the Pharos Lighthouse in Alexandria. That's just an artist's impression. Built under Ptolemy II around 260 BC, and standing at the western extremity of Alexandria, the Pharos Lighthouse was the forerunner of the modern lighthouse. It was listed by Philo as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Constructed of white stone, it stood around 500 feet high, was connected to the mainland by a causeway of 4,000 feet, and was surmounted by a massive statue of Zeus, upon which a powerful light, which could be seen out at sea, constantly shone. And to give an example of the type of society that existed in that time, if just taking Alexandria as an example, Alexandria was made after the death of Alexander the Great. He conquered the world and died at the age of 32. But when he went into the area which is Alexandria, he said this would be a perfect place. It's like a natural port. It would be a perfect place to make a city. And so his generals, after he died, went there and they built his city. And they made it on a grid. They made it in a very organized way. And they had one of the greatest universities on earth in Alexandria at that time.
Library.
Yeah. They also had the greatest library on earth at that time. And
Is that Constantinople?
no,
It's in Turkey. Constantinople
It
is
covers-
Istanbul at the moment.
I'm going to finish here with this because,
Constantinople is Istanbul in Turkey.
yeah,
And this is Alexandria.
it's Egypt. Okay, when I'm talking about advanced technologies, to understand this point, we only need to look at Alexandria, a city founded by the Greeks on the shores of Egypt in the 3rd century BC. Under the Ptolemies, Alexander's successors, the city rose to become the most famous centre of art, science and learning in the world. It covered some 2,000 acres, and unlike the majority of ancient cities, was built upon a regular plan and magnificently adorned with public buildings and works of art. So advanced was the study of mathematics and engineering at Alexandria that not only were they able to build a lighthouse the size of a 40-story skyscraper, but the world's first steam engine, crucial to the development of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, was also designed there. It's a guy called Hero of Alexandria 2,300 years ago designed the steam engine. Well, we don't know that he designed it, but there's certainly a drawing there with all the workings. You know, it may have easily existed long before that. Its climate was healthy, and it was supplied with pure water from a series of aqueducts. The city had up to 2 million inhabitants, and its market was a meeting place for the sale of goods from every region of the world. Alexandria was also a manufacturing city. This just gives you some idea. We're talking about the ancient world. It just gives you some idea of how similar it was actually to present day. Alexandria was also a manufacturing city with many carpet, incense and papyrus factories, as well as a glassworks. There is believed to have been 800 taverns, more than 1,500 bathhouses, 2,400 temples, and more than 24,000 homes. There were theatres, a stadium for games, a forum, a large market, an immense gymnasium, law courts, and a military barracks. Banking became a fundamental component of the Hellenized Egyptian economy. An official royal bank was established, and its centre in Alexandria, and with branches all over the country. So that you could even borrow money from the bank, and you could even get a mortgage in those days. 300 years BC. If you wanted to buy a house, you could go to the bank and get a mortgage. We think these are all modern things. Yeah, well, I've got that in the next one. As an adjunct to the royal treasury, it changed and loaned money, accepted deposits, and offered mortgages. According to one record, the annual revenue was 294 metric tons of gold, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. Okay, I think I should finish. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I've gone way over like yesterday. And there were things that I wanted to talk about, which I haven't had time.
The next function is people can take prashadam, and there's a Harinam, sit down Harinam just out in O'Connell Street.
Oh, right.
But that'll be 7:15.
Right.
So I mean, if you wanted to continue to do this here, that's fine.
Okay.
If they wanted to eat.
So this is Saturday night, so you have Harinam every Saturday?
Yeah.
All right,
So
okay.
7:15.
Yes, yeah.
And since many people did eat, we were going to take this moment in case anybody is really wiped out. Thank you everybody for signing the sheets today.